And it's this concept, is this notion, this idea, it's so strong that they have to have access. Without access to the Holy Land, they're sunk, because there's no place they can go at that time to get all these sins forgiven. Later on, years later, they could have done it in Jerusalem, but at that time they had to go there. And so they go, but somehow, in their mind, they decide that the Jews are the enemy, that the Jews are responsible for, in some way, for their situation, and so they start massacring Jewish communities along the way. So they go from France. You'd think they'd be going east. They go north first, and they just go to Jewish community, and just wipe them out or run them out, and then they just keep going. And this mob just is huge. It's estimated at some points, well over 100,000 people are in this horde, this mass movement. Just people, no plans, no organization, no food. They would just steal things along the way. I mean, it must have been a colossal mess, right? That group, Peter the Hermit's group, pretty well gets wiped out. But they get all the way to Antioch. It's amazing. That's in Syria, folks. I mean, this is a long, long way. They make it, primarily by land. And so they have quite a time. There's a famous children's crusade of these children who were led off to the Holy Land to save Jerusalem for the Christians and so on. Now, this is very controversial, so I won't necessarily give great credence to this, but the point was that those children were taken, and then once they got out of the country, then they were sold into slavery. It turned out to be a terrible disaster for many. Now, how did he get all these kids? But remember, it's not like our time, where kids are nailed down to a family. There's just lots of orphans and lots of children running around with no parents. They're just surviving off the land as best they can. And there aren't many foster homes or anything like that in those days. The shepherds mounted a crusade when they heard the king of France had been taken in Egypt. So all these French shepherds decided they're going to go save him. And of course, they all got wiped out for their trouble. Now, there were how many crusades? It's real hard to count because there's big ones and little ones. There's official ones. It's something like a dozen or more official crusades of the church. And then there are all these other little crusades that are spontaneous along the way. Now, one thing that I want to talk about in great detail, so I'm going to save it for next week, because this is a whole world inside this whole medieval flagellum. This is an amazing story. And these people men primarily, who go in great numbers around the countryside, whipping themselves. And all this blood everywhere. I am really astounded by that. But what I want to do, instead of going off into that, is I want to talk about another movement at about the same time. In other words, a movement that, whether it's malicious or not, we'll have to be the judge. But it's a movement called courtly love. Now, you want to talk about something that's had an impact on Western culture. You're going to be hard-pressed to find anything that has had a greater impact than courtly love. Now, there is a long story here, but I want to try to condense it down so we can get kind of to the essence of what courtly love is all about. Now, first of all, a great irony. Courtly love was born in Moorish Spain. In other words, there were these Moorish intellectuals in Spain that got obsessed with the idea that women should be worshipped. This was as revolutionary an idea as you can imagine. Where did it come from? Out of the Islamic community in Spain, back when the Moors were about 200, 300 years before they were finally run out of Spain. And there were two great Moorish philosophers who promoted this idea. And the idea was that women should be given preferential treatment, should be taken care of, and should be considered worthy of worship. Now, worship here is sort of in quotes, small w, but still worthy of worship. Now, tomes, dissertations have been written about what this was all about, where this came from, and what it meant. My own particular theory is that it has a lot to do with the great interest in Mother Goddess religion, which was very, very big in Europe before Christianity. And of course, Mother Goddess ideals got subsumed in the Roman Catholics' worship of the Virgin Mary. And this was one of the ways in which the worship of the feminine continued then into the future, was through the worship of the Virgin Mary. Well, the Catholic Church has always been this kind of ambivalence about should Mary be elevated in her station. And to this day, there are groups, Catholic groups, that want Mary to be assigned the position of co-redeemer. And every year the Vatican gets so many thousands of petitions, Mary should be co-redeemer. Because many people relate to Mary much more easily than they do Jesus. And this is a fascinating thing. Now I want to illustrate this by saying from Spain then through the Pyrenees up into France came the ideas of courtly love. Now it's called courtly love because it was practiced at court. And what happens over time is that whatever's done at court filters down into the middle class, right? And so this idea of courting, this idea that the man honors the woman in all things, except maybe military. That the woman is to be set aside, that she's to be set off, and she's to be taken care of and catered to and deferred to, right? And so the way it evolved in courtly love, everybody at court basically was married by contract. In other words, a famous king would be married to somebody's princess over here, and then she would move, and that would bond the two countries together. And all the royal houses of Europe, all interconnected, everybody's intermarried, all the way down to World War I. This is what caused World War I, for God's sake, right? All these royal aristocratic connections between families. And so it is this situation in which the court would create what they called the ménage à trois. Which loosely translates as the mixture of three, the three that come together. So you have, let's just say it's the king, and then the queen, and then you have the king has a lover over here. Now, the king's energy, the king's devotion, the king's primary responsibility to his wife is to have what they call an heir and a spare. The king or queen have an heir and a spare. If they do that, that's their responsibility. So we see this all the way down in modern time. Remember, Prince Charles was getting in his 40s, and his mother said, "You got to get married." They handed him a book. And they said, "Look through the book. See, all these girls have been certified to have enough blue blood for you to marry. Have to be royalty." Well, he wasn't particularly interested in getting married, but he had his partner, Camille, right? But he had to marry somebody, so he looked through and he found Diana Spencer, and so, well, she's pretty, probably a good one. So, you get married in this fairy tale, Cinderella kind of thing. So what does she do? She has an heir, she has a spare. As soon as she has a spare, Charles is gone. And she's left out. Now, this makes perfect sense to the medieval mind, because that's courtly law. In other words, queen did her duty, king did his, lover. Now, you'll all remember, of course, Camelot. Here's Arthur, here's Guinevere. Only in this case, the menage a trois went this way, and you have over here Lancelot.
Lancelot, yeah.
Okay. And of course, that caused all the trouble. Now, if you had gone back to the Middle Ages, these 12th, 13th, 14th century, everybody at court would be involved in courtly law. In other words, you were married to somebody, but your love relationship was somebody else, right? And this is then the case when we come to the most famous, I would say, of all queens of the Middle Ages. Who is the most famous? Guinevere in Camelot was, this is mythical, right? But this lady really lived. Who would you say is the most famous queen in the Middle Ages?
Elizabeth?
Antoinette
Elizabeth?
is famous, but she's not in the Middle Ages, yeah.
Elizabeth. Eleanor, what the heck?
Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, let me tell you about Eleanor. Eleanor of Aquitaine lived 1122. So, 1122. So this is, 12th century. Eventually, her court became the center of courtly law. Now, most of you, if you know Eleanor of Aquitaine at all, you know her because of the famous movie, The Lion in Winter.
Yes.
Remember in The Lion in Winter, the part of Eleanor of Aquitaine was played by Katharine Hepburn. Her
Yes.
Probably her greatest performance of her entire career, and one of her last. And then Henry II was her husband, King of England, and they played by Peter O'Toole. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so Lion in Winter gives you an idea about how what you really see in that movie is the conflict between the king and the queen. Now, having said that, you have to realize that Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the very few women in history to be the queen of two countries. She was Queen of England, and that's, she was first Queen of France under Louis VII. And with him, she had two girls. And then that marriage, famous breakup. Very unusual in the Middle Ages, by the way, for marriage to break up. And then she eventually marries Henry II, who becomes the queen. She becomes the Queen of England. He's the King of England. With Louis, She had 2 girls. With Henry, this guy that she was so contentious with, they had 8 children. So she had a grand total of 10 children. And of those 10 children, 3 of them ended up being kings. So, kings. In other words, a mother with 3 kings. Unheard of. Unheard of. Of course, unheard of to be queen of 2 countries. Eleanor of Aquitaine, and you might ask, well, how'd she pull this off? And the answer partly is this. They said, this is the official line on her, that she was so beautiful that she was beyond beauty. She was beyond beauty. In other words, she was not just an ordinary stunner. She was beyond that and way, way past that. And so she was very, very, very high demand, I suppose. And they compared her to, some of the famous women of all time. For example, the queen of the Amazonian women was considered a great beauty, and Eleanor of Aquitaine was considered more beautiful than her. Now, one of her sons, of course, was Richard the Lionheart, and who got caught up in the Crusades, and then, there's an awful lot of history connected to Richard the Lionheart. Now, what I found amazing beyond all this, that on top of having 10 kids and doing all this stuff, she also made a crusade. And she was on a particular crusade, the Second Crusade, which turned out to be a kind of fiasco. So she never actually got to Jerusalem. But she certainly wanted to. In other words, we have this idea, I think, that people in the Middle Ages never got anywhere. And then you read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And some of these people are all over. The first character in the Canterbury Tales is the knight. And the knight has been on dozens of crusades. He's been up in Germany, Russia, Poland, all up in there. He's been way down in Africa. He's been all over the eastern end of the Mediterranean and all over Europe in various crusades. And he just has come home from a crusade when he goes on the Canterbury Tales. The trip to Canterbury, in which he appears. Now, all of this, to me, again, is back to this where we started about how this concept of pilgrimage is so important to him. Eleanor of Aquitaine, she certainly wasn't obliged. First of all, she's a woman, so she's not obliged to go. And she certainly had a lot of things to take care of, all these kids. And she wanted to go on the crusade. So she did, right? So, in my opinion, that's pretty amazing. Now, I want to, over my time here, the reason is I like to keep this under an hour because I don't want anybody to get exhausted, and also I want to leave time if you have any comments or questions, because what I'm going to do in the next 2 weeks is we're going to talk about other forms of movements that are very malicious, in my opinion. By the way, why would you think that courtly love might be a malicious movement? Well, because the middle class copied the upper class, only they tried to integrate, they tried to fuse together courtly love and marriage, which is essentially what we have. And, until not that long ago, they didn't call it dating, they call it courting.
Courting.
Or courting down south. You do it the way they do it at court. In other words, you treat women the way you do it at court. Now, holding women in such high honor, I think, might have been of great value. It came out of courtly love. But there was a price to be paid for it, and that price was that women are always under control, being taken care of by somebody. That was the idea. So you're taken care of officially by your husband, but then you're taken care of in other ways. romantically speaking, by the lover. So we have Valentine's Day, which is the great moment for romance and promoting romance. But the fact of the matter is, none of that would be possible without courtly love. Now, the system that the man courts the woman, and the woman decides which man she wants. We have that. We call it dating. People decide. Now, you have to judge whether that system is a viable system. How many marriages in the United States, particularly among young people, survive?
50%.
Yeah, if you're lucky. Now, that's done under the name of people have the right, to fail. And I'm not necessarily arguing against that. I'm just saying that as a system, it's a system that depends very heavily on the concept of romance. But is that really, from the point of society, there's a big price to be paid, and there's a lot of social chaos that comes out of when marriages break up, when families break up. And so there is, all these things have their benefit, and then they have, you have to weigh, it's kind of weigh things in the balance. But I think as Americans, we're so used to the idea of individual freedom. It's impossible for us not to see it this way, see the social destruction that comes when the thing gets too out of hand, right? Freedom's great, but with responsibility, but people forget the responsibility side of it quite often, because they want what they want when they want it. All right, anybody have any comments or anything you'd like to ask about dealing with pilgrimages, crusades, orthodoxy, any of the subjects we touched on? Some of the things I've touched on tonight, I'll go into a greater depth in the next 2 weeks. Anybody want to bring anything up?
The Crusades, aren't we in somewhat of a crusade activity with all of the problems against Islamic terrorism?
I've always said, Americans are very good crusaders. We always have these crusades, right? When I was a kid, in about the 4th or 5th grade, we would have these little packets. We went around the neighborhood and collected dimes. And then we had to go to school, and one day we had to march a dime. We had to march with our dimes. And so we were proud that our class got called, and each of us would take our little dime packs. They have these big, what do they call these things here? Where you put, there'd be a place and you'd stick your dimes in. And that was the early 1950s. And in 1954 or 55, Joe Saul, who had been the recipient of all that money for at least 10 years since the war, came up with vaccine to prevent polio. Now, I lived, as a little kid in terror of polio, because we saw pictures of kids in Iron Lung. I just couldn't imagine it. It was just terrible. And then there were kids that had polio, and they had braces and all this. One of the most famous Americans with that had polio, came out of it with how many scars? Who?
Roosevelt?
Well, Roosevelt was pretty badly crippled. I'm talking about somebody, well-known person in American, well-known American actor who came out of it because they took him to a Roman Catholic sister named Sister Kenny. And her therapy was not the iron lung. Her therapy was constant rubbing. His name is Alan Alda. Remember Alan Alda, MASH and so on? Alan Alda had polio, but you would never know it because
Right.
he had went through the Sister Kenny system. Yeah, it's funny. I pick up, anybody can tell you that knows me. I just pick up these little bits of information. This weekend I learned that Garrison Keillor was an Asperger's kid. Asperger's. Yeah, which explains a lot Because, you know, he gives those, if you've ever seen him in person, he never uses a note. It just pours out of him.
Is that the Lake Wobegon guy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the detail
Right.
of your calls.
Huh?
The detail, the level of detail.
Oh, yeah, the detail is just there. And that, you know, Asperger's have this brain, you know, and it's just, but if you came up to Garrison, if Garrison gave you right, I can't look you in the eye. Well, when he came down to Holland Park United Methodist Church, they brought him in, you know, to have a talk, and they were all just obsessed. He wouldn't actually talk to anybody. It was kind of rude and crude, but it's because, again, that's why he went into radio. It's his voice. Everybody knows that voice, right? By the way, the voice in the back here is my daughter Robin and her husband Brian. I want you all, if you have a chance afterwards, to say hello, Robin. Robin is the director of special events at the Meadows Museum at SMU, and has one of those dream jobs we all wish we had. And so we're very, very, very proud of Robin, who has now been 1 year of marriage to this, and is 1 year at SMU. It's really been terrific. So really happy to have them here back in Texas. So now she can come to see the program. You knew her from, weren't you on the Rose Bowl trip, Robin?
One of them.
Yeah, they were on the Rose Bowl trip. Robin was there. Reggie was there.
Come see our Rivera show before it closes.
Yeah, just stand up and announce it so they can all hear it.
Hi guys, I'm Robin Linick from the Meadows Museum. We have a lot of great programming and we have wonderful docents. This summer it's going to be really quiet, but in the next just a few days, so I think it's actually going to close out at the end of this week, I want to say our great, beautiful drawing show, Rivera Drawings, is going to close. I really thought it was going to be a Salzier, but it ended up being a silk purse. It's a glorious, beautiful exhibition. In the fall, we have a Zerberon show coming in. It's Jacob and his 12 sons, and it's extraordinary. It's the first time it'll be viewed outside of England. It's been in a castle in England for 250 years, and I keep telling Dad about it. It's just going to be a really amazing show. So please come and see that, and then we're going to have a small Picasso Rivera show that opens in August. So come see us. Thank you. Maybe I'll bring passes next week if we come out.
Yeah, please pass out some brochures.
Yeah, and Thursday nights were free, so come by tomorrow night after 5. Okay, great.
Okay, yes, sir, please.
When you talk about crusades, these are very small things, but I grew up during World War II. And we had 2 crusades as children. Number one was we went out and we picked kapok or milkweed pods.
Really?
And they took those and made life jackets out of them for the Navy.
Well, good grief.
And the